The Blackwood Bay Historical Society was not a place of modern convenience. It was a building constructed of stubborn Maine granite and silver gray cedar, perched precariously on a jagged cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic. Inside, the air was a pressurized capsule of another century. It smelled of vanilla-scented, decaying paper, beeswax floor polish, and the faint, dry aroma of pressed October leaves. It was a cathedral of memory, a labyrinth of rolling ladders and mahogany stacks, and its high priest was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same ancient stone as the foundation. Arthur Penhaligon was 70 years old, or so the meticulously forged town records claimed. In truth, Arthur had seen the turn of 2 centuries, the rise and fall of empires, and the steady, encroaching tide of a world that was slowly forgetting the monsters that lived in its shadows. He was a man of iron-spined elegance, usually found in a charcoal tweed vest with a gold pocket watch tucked into the fob, a watch that kept a rhythm only he truly understood. His hair was a thick, distinguished shock of silver, combed back with military precision. His eyes, however, were his tell. They were the color of the Atlantic before a gale, a deep, turbulent teal that held the weight of 1,000 secrets. Arthur was a great gray wolf, a prime alpha of a lineage that predated the written word. He was the keeper of the ledger, the man responsible for the genealogical records and blood contracts of every shifter family in the Western Hemisphere. In a world that was rapidly digitizing and erasing its history, Arthur was the anchor. He lived a life of scholarly solitude, finding more comfort in the company of 18th century vellum than in the noisy neon world outside. He was content with his silence. He was satisfied with his duty. Until Martha moved into the seaside cottage at the end of the lane. Martha Miller was 66, a retired investigative journalist from Chicago who had spent 3 decades staring down mobsters, corrupt senators, and the kind of men who thought they were untouchable. She had a sharp bob of white hair, a collection of colorful silk scarves, and a pair of reading glasses she wore on a chain like a tactical weapon. She had moved to Blackwood Bay for a quiet retirement, but Martha was a woman built on the pursuit of truth. Silence, to her, was merely a place where a lie was hiding. She walked into the library on a Tuesday afternoon, the brass bell above the door giving a polite, resonant chime. Arthur didn't look up from a fragile 19th century ship's log, but his nostrils flared. Even through the scent of old paper, he caught her. She smelled of Earl Grey tea, expensive rain boots, and a relentless, terrifying intelligence. Most importantly, she didn't smell like the other locals. She didn't have the scent of inherited fear. "Mr. Penhaligon?" she asked, her voice crisp and entirely unimpressed by the gloom of the stacks. "I am," Arthur replied, his voice a low, melodic baritone that sounded like a cello being played in an empty stone room. He looked up, his teal eyes meeting hers with the practiced neutrality of a man used to being a ghost. "I'm doing a bit of light research on the founding families of this bay," Martha said, leaning against the mahogany counter. And she didn't wait for an invitation. She simply opened a manila folder and slid 3 photocopies across the desk. "And I've run into a bit of a mathematical impossibility." Arthur didn't move. He looked down at the clippings. One was a grainy photograph from 1924, showing the library's dedication. Another was a color-faded shot from 1970, a centennial celebration. The third was a digital print from last week's local gazette. In every photo, standing in the exact same spot by the library fireplace, was Arthur. The same jawline, the same broad shoulders, the same teal eyes. He hadn't aged a single day in over 100 years. Arthur felt the familiar, heavy pulse of his wolf in his veins, a slow, rhythmic thrum of warning that usually preceded a fight. Lighting can be deceptive in old photographs, Mrs. Miller, and families often share a strong resemblance. "Don't Mrs. Miller me, Arthur. I spent 30 years chasing politicians through dark alleys and reading between the lines of redacted files," Martha said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "You're either the best-preserved man in New England, or you're the secret this town has been keeping since the Mayflower landed. I'm leaning toward the latter." Arthur closed the ship's log with a soft thud that echoed through the empty library. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a fire in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a human in decades. Most people looked at the elderly and saw shadows, a demographic to be ignored. Martha looked at him and saw a headline. "What do you want, Martha?" "I want to know what's behind the iron door in the basement," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I want to know why the sheriff salutes you when you walk past his car. You aren't just a librarian, Arthur. You're the law." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong in a house of books. It was a high-pitched electronic whine, the sound of a thermal drill biting into reinforced steel. Arthur's head snapped toward the back of the library. His teal eyes flared into a brilliant, predatory gold, the pupils dilating until the iris was a mere sliver of light. The scholarly librarian vanished, replaced by something ancient and lethal. "Get behind the desk, Martha. Lock the drawer. Do not come out until I say," Arthur commanded. "I am not a damsel in distress, Arthur." "I am not asking," Arthur roared, the sound vibrating the crystal inkwells on his desk and making the heavy velvet curtains shiver. The iron door to the restricted section was being breached. 3 men in tactical gear, wearing specialized masks to shield them from the wolf scent sensors Arthur had hidden in the ventilation, burst through the side service entrance. These weren't common thieves. They were the Eradicators, a radical splinter group of the Hunter Council. Their ideology was simple. To destroy a people, you must first destroy their history. If they got the ledger, every shifter family living a quiet, peaceful life in the suburbs would be exposed. Every child with a secret would be hunted. "The Grey Wolf is mine," the lead hunter shouted, leveling a heavy-duty crossbow loaded with a silver nitrate harpoon. Arthur didn't run. He didn't duck for cover. He stood in the center of the reading room, his tweed vest straining as his torso expanded. He didn't undergo a full, 4-legged shift. That would be too destructive to the books. He underwent a legacy shift. His hands became massive, fur-covered paws with claws like obsidian razors, and his face took on the noble, terrifying mask of the Prime Alpha. "You are in a house of silence," Arthur growled, his voice a tectonic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "And you are being far too loud." The hunter fired. Arthur caught the silver harpoon in mid-air, the metal sizzling against his palm, the scent of burning fur filling the room. He didn't flinch. He snapped the shaft like a toothpick and launched himself over the mahogany desk. He moved with a speed that defied his perceived age, a silver blur of predatory grace. He used the environment he had known for a century. He grabbed a rolling ladder, kicked off the wall, and swung through the stacks like a pendulum of vengeance, dropping onto the hunters from above. Martha watched from behind the desk, her heart racing with an electric jolt of adrenaline she thought had retired, along with her press pass. She saw one hunter aiming a specialized incendiary device at a shelf containing the original 17th century pack treaties. "Oh, no you don't, you little thug," she hissed. She grabbed a heavy, solid brass bookend shaped like a nautical anchor, a 5-pound piece of metal, and launched it with the practiced aim of a woman who had once been a star pitcher. It caught the hunter square in the temple just as he went to light the fuse. He crumpled into a heap of tactical nylon, as the bomb rolling harmlessly onto the rug. Arthur looked back at her, a bloody clawed hand resting on the poetry shelf. Even in his half-beast form, his expression was one of profound, stunned surprise. "Nice shot, Martha," he rumbled. "Focus, Arthur. There's a third one by the basement stairs, and he's got a bag." The final hunter was smarter. He had managed to snatch a vellum-bound diary, the primary key to the Northern Pack's hidden sanctuary, and was heading for the shattered window. Arthur let out a howl that shattered the glass in every lampshade in the room. He didn't just run. He hunted. He tackled the man through the window, both of them tumbling out onto the salt-slicked grass of the cliffside. The hunter pulled a silver-edged combat knife, but Arthur was an alpha of the old world. See, he pinned the man to the ground with a single paw, his golden eyes inches from the hunter's face. Tell your council that as long as I draw breath, the history of my people will remain in the light. Now run, before I forget my manners and my diet. The library was a shambles. Shards of glass were everywhere, and the metallic, bitter scent of silver nitrate hung heavy in the air, clashing with the peaceful smell of old books. Arthur sat on the floor in the center of the room, his human form returned, but his hand badly burned from the harpoon. He looked around at the ruined stacks, a look of deep, ancient exhaustion on his face. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war for 100 years and had finally realized he was tired. Martha walked over carrying a small first aid kit she'd found in the break room. She sat down beside him on the rug, her colorful silk scarf now stained with dust, and she didn't care one bit. "You're a very stubborn man, Arthur Penhaligon," she said softly, taking his burned hand in hers. She began to clean the wound with a soothing, cool salve. "I have had a lot of practice," Arthur sighed, leaning his head back against a shelf of biographies. He looked at her, his teal eyes returning to their human depth. "You should leave Blackwood Bay, Martha. Tonight. Now that you've seen the ledger, you're a target. They won't stop." Martha looked up at him, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. "I spent 30 years being told where I couldn't go, what I couldn't say, and who was too dangerous to interview. I just found the greatest story of my life, Arthur, and I think I found a man worth staying for. I'm not going anywhere." Arthur felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his wolf's internal furnace. It was a human heat, the feeling of being seen for who he was, not what he represented. "I cannot offer you a quiet retirement, Martha. I am a relic. I am a target, and I am older than the very trees in your garden." "Arthur," Martha said, patting his hand with a firm, comforting touch, "I'm 66. I don't want a quiet retirement. I want a partner who can keep up with me, and I suspect a 100-year-old wolf who fights for history is the only one who can." A month later, the Blackwood Bay Historical Society had a new sign, painted in elegant gold leaf. Penhaligon and Miller, Archival Research and Preservation. The restricted section was still restricted, but now there were 2 desks inside the iron door. So one for the alpha who protected the past with his claws, and one for the journalist who ensured the future was recorded with her pen. They spent their mornings researching the lost lineages of the Great North, and their evenings on the porch of the library, watching the Maine sunset turn the Atlantic into liquid gold. Martha had started writing a fictional series about a secret society of wolves, and Arthur served as her primary consultant, often correcting her on the specific politics of the 1920s wolf gangs. The hunters still watched from the shadows of the pine trees, but they stayed clear of the library on the cliff. They knew that the Silver Keeper was no longer a lonely relic of a dying age. He had a partner who was just as sharp as his claws, twice as relentless, and who knew exactly where to aim a brass bookend. As Arthur watched Martha circle a name in a ledger with a triumphant, "Aha!" he realized that his life hadn't ended at 70. It had simply reached the most interesting chapter. "Are you coming to bed, Arthur?" Martha called from the hallway, her green eyes twinkling with a fire that made his wolf pace with joy. Arthur closed the ledger of the pack, his gold pocket watch clicking shut in his palm. "In a moment, my dear. I just need to check the locks on the north wing." "The locks are fine, you old wolf," she laughed, leaning against the doorframe. "Come here. I want to hear that story about the time you met Hemingway in Paris again. And don't leave out the part about the silver bullet." Arthur smiled, a wide, genuine, wolfish grin. He walked toward her, his silver hair catching the moonlight, realizing that some things, like a good story and a great woman, only get better with time. The townspeople of Blackwood Bay began to notice a change. The Historical Society wasn't just a dusty building anymore, it was vibrant. Sometimes, late at night, the sound of jazz music would drift down the cliff, along with the silhouette of 2 people dancing in front of the fireplace. One a silver-haired gentleman, the other a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she had finally found home. Arthur still kept the ledger. But now he also kept a small, leather-bound book on his own nightstand. It wasn't about the pack or the hunters or the war for survival. It was a collection of Martha's favorite poems with her handwritten notes in the margins. It was a record of a human life, woven into his own. And for an alpha who had lived for a century, he finally understood that the most important history wasn't the one you recorded. It was the one you were currently living.